Greetings and welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. It's by Jesus and it's of Jesus at the same time. This next slide depicts why communication skills are so important in relationships in general, but in particular in the marriage relationship. Take a look at this. It's semantics. Anyway, I'll give you time to think about that. And here's a punny, if not funny, attempt at humor. And there you go. And as I said, this is the apocalypse, the revelation of Jesus Christ, the book we call Revelation at the end of the Bible. And we will, we've just finished looking at chapters 1 through 5. I've got a couple of narrated PowerPoints up on YouTube for those chapters. The next, not this one, but the following narrated presentation, we'll begin our look at chapters 6 through 19, which is the judgment chapter, the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments. And the spaces in between them, which are called interludes, among other names. But this is an introduction to that section, chapters 6 through 19. So why don't we invite the Lord to come to guide us through this. Father, thank you for, there's so much to thank you for, Lord. Mostly your love, which is evident daily, your patience, your forbearance, your forgiveness of sin, Lord, the plans you have for us, which we're looking at in this book that we call Revelation. And so, Father, we invite you to open our eyes and open our ears and open our hearts, Lord, so that you can speak to us, so that this book can speak to us. You've promised a blessing as we read it and as we hear it and as we do it. And so give us eyes to see and hearts that are inclined to obey. And Lord, we can't do anything without you, so we ask you to be our guide, to speak to us clearly, and we will thank you in advance for the things we're going to learn here. And Lord, I pray that in every way we would honor you. Thank you for blessing us. Thank you for being a blessing God. Amen. So, what's the plan? All right, we're going to look at the structure first of chapters 6 through 19, and then we'll briefly look at the Olivet Discourse, which is Matthew 24 and 25. We'll be concentrating on Matthew 24. And then we'll take probably an equally quick look at Daniel's vision in chapter 7, and that will, of course, include Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 of Daniel. Those two are related. Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, Daniel's vision in chapter 7 basically cover the same time period and the same kingdoms of the world. And then finally, just a quick look at how do things fit together in the book of Revelation. We have the three series of 7. We have the 7 seals, we have the 7 trumpets, and we have the 7 bowls. And we'll look at these in a little more detail as we go on. And the question we'll be asking towards the end is, how do they fit together? Are they sequential? Are they parallel? Do they run all concurrently and just intensify as we get closer and closer to the end? So that's an important question that we'll consider as we continue in our study. So let's look at the structure of this section. Chapters 6 through 19, as I said, it contains the three judgment series, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. So there's just a pictorial of a scroll with 7 seals on it. And in fact, as we get to chapter 6, the first 6 seals are covered in chapter 6. And then there's an interlude. There's a break. Chapter 7 has some other descriptive things in it. And then we get to the 7th and final seal in the first verse of chapter 8. So there you can see that there's a break between seal number 6 and seal number 7. And we call that an interlude. There's 3 interludes, actually 2. The second one is broken into 2 parts. We'll see that in a second. But anyway, that's how the first couple of chapters here are organized. Next, once we get to the 7th seal, that introduces the 7 trumpets, and those also are split in a 6-in-1 configuration. Only this time, the interlude is in 2 parts. The first 6 trumpets are essentially chapters 8 and 9. And the interlude, broken into 2 sections. The first section is chapter 10 through most of chapter 11, but not quite all of it, through verse 14 of chapter 11. So that's the second interlude, or the first part of the second interlude. We get to the 7th trumpet in verses 15 through 19 of chapter 11. So again, we have kind of a segmented approach here, where we've seen the 6 trumpet judgments, and then we have almost 2 chapters of an interlude. Then we get the 7th trumpet, and then we get the rest of this second interlude, which is chapters 12 through 14. So you can get a sense of start, stop, start, stop. We are advancing along in time during the judgments. In other words, the 7 seals progress forward in time, the 7 trumpets progress forward in time, the 7 bowls progress forward in time. And it seems to me, it's not stated explicitly, but it seems to me that each of those is a shorter time period. In other words, the trumpets are in a time period that's less than or shorter than the time period that involves the seal judgments. And then the 7 bowls seem to be compressed even more than the trumpets. And again, we'll take a look at how those fit together towards the end of this presentation. So here we see the first 6 trumpet judgments, chapters 8 and 9. Chapters 10 and 11, we have an interlude. Then we have the 7th trumpet in the last 4 verses of chapter 11. And then we have 3 more chapters, 12, 13, and 14. That complete this second interlude. Or you can think of it as a 2-part interlude, or as interlude number 2 and interlude number 3. When we get to the bowl judgments, they seem very compressed. As you read chapter 16, chapter 15 introduces them, and then chapter 16 goes through them, and it would seem to go through them very quickly. And they do not have the 6-in-1 configuration that the seal and trumpet judgments have. They just run very sequentially, very concurrently, not concurrently. One right after the other, let me put it that way. I'm searching for the words here, and they're not coming. And so there's the look at the structure of this. And when we finish chapter 16, the seventh bowl of God's wrath has been poured out, and the angel cries out, "It is done," or "It is finished." So in a nutshell, that's how this section, chapter 6 through 16, are organized. 6 seals, an interlude, the 7th seal, an interlude, the 6 trumpets, another interlude, the 7th trumpet, an interlude, and then finally the 7 seals. And there's maybe just the briefest of interludes after the 7 bowls. Did I say seals? That was a mistake. Sorry. The bowl judgments, they are all 7 run in very quick succession. And that brings us to chapters 17 and 18, which depict the fall of Babylon. And we'll get there eventually. For now, let's move on to something that helps us put what we study in the rest of the prophetic scripture in perspective, and that's the Olivet Discourse, so called because Jesus was on the Mount of Olives when he gave it. And it's found in Matthew 24, and Luke has a shorter version of it in Luke chapter 17. So basically what we have is Jesus coming out of the temple with his disciples, or they're looking back something wistfully, and they come up and say, "Jesus, look at those beautiful buildings that, the temple precincts. Must have been quite stunning. It was actually 46 years under construction." And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. In verse 3, he came and sat on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And if you read between the lines there, what they're asking him is, well, when that happens, when that temple is torn down, obviously that's going to be the end of history as we know it, the end of our time. That means you're coming back. When's that going to happen? And what will be the sign of your coming back and of the end of the age? They had all these 3 things kind of the same event. The coming down of the temple, and then the sign of Jesus' return, and of the end of the age. He's told them he's coming back. He just hasn't told them when. So now they're asking, when? When's the temple coming down, and when are you coming back? And in fact, their assumption is that when the temple comes down, Jesus is coming back, and there's going to be some signs accompanying that return. And we'll look at some of those a little bit later once we finish with as we go through the Olivet Discourse. So the first question they ask is, when will these things be? And unbeknownst to them, that's different. That's going to be a different answer. When will the temple be destroyed? That's probably 40 years from the time they're asking the question. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now those two are really the same question, just asked in different ways. So the sign of your coming and the end of the age, Jesus is going to speak to those. But in a normal fashion, he's not going to really tell us when he's answering one question and then when he's answering the second question. So the first question is, when will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? And their second question, what's going to be the sign of your coming, which will signify the end of the age? And Jesus just goes right into it. Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. So there are going to be many that are deceived. It's an age of deception. It's an age of misinformation that might strike a note with you. Fake news come to mind. You will hear of wars, rumors of wars. Don't be troubled. These have to happen, but the end isn't there yet. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilence, earthquake in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. And some interpret that as the beginning of birth pangs, which start spaced out, and then the pain intensifies and the spacing shrinks until they're very, very sharp pains, and they're very, very close together. Well, if you look carefully at this particular section here, verses 4 through 8, what's on the screen, let's just compare them to the 4 horsemen in chapter 6, the white horse, the red horse, the black horse, and the pale horse. So Jesus said there's going to be a deceiver, and many will be deceived. And that corresponds to the rider on the white horse. Now, some commentaries you read will say that that's Jesus. But I'm pretty sure that it's not, because he's the first of 3 riders that come forth in the way of judgment. And this rider is he has a bow, and he's given a crown. And so we'll learn in Daniel that one of the horns of the beast that Daniel sees representing the end days speaks great things, or pompous words. And so this is believed to be, by most conservative scholars, to be the Antichrist, who forges a worldwide kingdom, temporarily at least. But many are going to be deceived by this deceiver. And so that corresponds to the white horse. And then there's wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And that's the rider of the red horse. He's going to be given a great sword, and he's going to take peace from the earth. And then Jesus speaks of famines, and that would correspond to the rider on the black horse, who has a pair of scales in his hand, and that speaks of scarcity and inflation and the food regime. And so when armies are on the march, or when bombs are falling, it's hard to harvest crops or plant crops or even do anything that would bring food to the table. So it's going to be a time of famine. And pestilence, finally, the rider on the pale horse. Pestilence is disease and sickness, which could be very much a result of the wars and the rumors of wars, and the pestilence and the earthquakes that are mentioned here as well. So Jesus' description here in these verses 4 through 8 follows the same order that the 4 horsemen of the first 4 seals in chapter 6 of Revelation follow. And so there's a pretty good match in terms of the sequence of the horses matching what Jesus has prophesied here in these verses. And what he does next, he gives us a sense of timing after the wars, after the deception, after the wars, after the famine, the pestilence, and the earthquakes. Then, after all those things, then they will deliver you up. Then many will be offended. Then many false prophets rise up and deceive many. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. So he's not pulling any punches here. He's telling us exactly what's coming. He's saying it's going to be difficult, and you need to endure to the end. And that's part of the purpose of Revelation, is to encourage and strengthen the church and believers for whatever is coming. And then he makes a reference to a term used in Daniel, and he coins the phrase abomination of desolation. So when you see that spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and in saying that, Jesus, of course, authenticated the entire book of Daniel, and Daniel as a prophet, as a historical figure, and as a spokesman for God. So when you see this abomination of desolation, and that's Daniel chapter 9, standing in the holy place, then that's time to get out of town. Don't pack a bag, don't go back to the house, get out of town. And in AD 70, when the Romans came in and set up a siege of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, anybody that took his advice saw Rome standing in the holy place, the abomination of desolation, and they would have vacated Jerusalem before that time and probably saved their lives as a result. It could also refer to the end times, when the Antichrist is going to be that abomination of desolation, the very last one, and he's going to stand in the holy place. We'll see that in chapter 13, and he's going to demand worship at that point. So Jesus is now answering the question, when will these things be? And he doesn't tell them, when or how long it's going to be. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, that's when you need to take action. And then he has another for then. So as this abomination of desolation is viewed standing in the holy place, then there will be great tribulation. Okay, and as I've said, many people believe that great tribulation is the last 3.5 years of that 7-year tribulation period spoken of in Daniel chapter 9. And Jesus makes this statement, which tells us this is indeed the last days. This is the end times. This is not the AD 70 invasion by Rome, because that was a regional thing. It wasn't worldwide. He says, unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And he says also, you still need to beware of deception. If anyone says, here's the Christ, or there it is, don't believe it. False Christs are going to rise up. He's going to say, when I come, everybody's going to know. Toward the bottom of the slide there, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So there's not going to be any mistaking it. And this is not speaking of the rapture. This is speaking of his second coming. The rapture is going to be kind of a secret thing. The world is not going to see Jesus. They're going to see the results of the people that are missing, but he's not revealing himself in the rapture unless it's just to the church that is snatched away. But here he's revealing himself as lightning flashes from the east to the west. Every eye will see him. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. And as you read the 7 bowl judgments, you realize that at the end of those, the earth can't support life. The seas are turned to blood. The fresh waters turn to blood. There's no water to drink. The sun is shining 7 times hotter. There's a darkness that's so thick you could cut it with a knife. There's boils on people. There's an army on the loose. It's a horrible time. But the fact that there's no water and the sun is shining 7 times its normal strength, who can survive that for more than a day or two? And so if those days were not shortened, every single person on the planet would have died. And so Jesus said, for the sake of the elect, he's going to shorten those days. He's going to come back and put an end to all the nonsense and all the suffering as soon as that last person has repented. And then as lightning comes from the east to the west, as I said, there's not going to be any mistaking it. It's going to be, there he is. There he is. And Jesus continues immediately after the tribulation of those days, when I come back to shorten it. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That looks an awful lot like the 6th seal. The 6th seal is almost those same events happening, and so we'll take a look at that. Then, there's another then, after the tribulation of those days, all those things in the heavens are going to happen. And after that, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. After the heavens have been cleared out of the other lights, the sign of the Son of Man. So that would tell me the only light in the sky at that point is going to be him. And all the tribes of the earth are going to mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. We'll take a look at that, some Old Testament scriptures depicting that. He's going to send his angels with the sound of a trumpet. They'll gather together his elect from the four winds. And again, this is not the rapture. If this were the rapture, it would be at the end of the 7-year tribulation period. The rapture, if this is speaking of the rapture, then that means the rapture doesn't happen until Jesus comes back and sets his feet touch the Mount of Olives. So this is not speaking of the rapture. This is speaking of the separation of the righteous from the unrighteous, the blessed by the Father from the wicked. And you can read about that in Matthew 25, starting at verse 31. So he's going to send his angels. We know from the wheat and the tares parable that his angels are the reapers, and they separate. They take the tares out, they bundle them up to be burned, and the wheat is gathered into his barn. And that's a picture of removing the wicked and of the righteous entering in human flesh, in bodily form, into the millennial kingdom. The sun will be darkened, as I said. We'll take a look at that. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. What is that? I don't really know. I have a feeling it's just going to be this amazing burst of light, but there's probably more to it than that. So, and everybody's going to see him coming with power and great glory. He's going to send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. And if we back up a little bit and see all the tribes of the earth will mourn, who's mourning? Certainly not people that are believers. They're going to be celebrating because they've just come through the worst times anybody will have ever seen on this planet, through the Great Tribulation. Who's mourning? The people on the earth that are going to mourn are the ones that have rejected God's gracious offer of forgiveness and eternal life through Jesus Christ. And so all those who dwell on the earth in Revelation is code for the unsaved. They are going to be mourning. And he says, when you see all these things, know that it's near. And so all these things, the deceiver, the wars and rumors of war, the famine all over, pestilence, earthquakes in various places, the attacks on the church, and the signs in the heavens. After the tribulation of those days, the sun will be blackened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers in heaven will be shaken. So when you see all of these things, know that it is near at the doors. And then he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And so there's a little bit of mystery to that statement. Some take it that from 1948, the next 80 years, everything's going to happen. And that may very well work out. But if you survive, if Earth survives into the 2030s and the 2040s, don't be surprised. I don't think we've got this thing figured out yet. Heaven and earth are going to pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. In other words, don't be dogmatic about this. Don't say this or that has to happen, because it's been proven over and over again that what we think has to happen doesn't have to happen. What God thinks, yes, that has to happen, no question. So that's a very quick look at that Olivet Discourse. In fact, it's only a look at a part of it, because that's Matthew 24. Matthew 25, there's more to it in 24, and then Matthew 25 continues the Olivet Discourse. But we're going to move on now, and we're going to take a look at first Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. And again, this is going to be a very quick look. And Nebuchadnezzar sees a statue made of different metals: gold at the head, silver at the arms and chest, belly and thighs of bronze, thighs and legs of, or legs and calves of iron, and then the feet of iron mixed with clay. And basically think of it as a timeline. Daniel's day is the head of gold, the feet of iron mixed with clay. That's the very end times. That's the kingdom of the Antichrist and the Great Tribulation. And so think of it as a timeline beginning at the head and moving toward the feet. And in Daniel's day, 750-ish, Alexander in 330, the silver, the Persians is the bronze, and the Roman Empire, which lasted from about 150 BC to 450 AD, roughly. So there's the timeline up to when John wrote. Rome was still in power, and it continues on to the feet. Of course, I've got question marks there because we don't know what year that's going to happen. That hasn't happened yet. And so Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue made out of precious metals. We're going to see that Daniel had quite a different view of the same time period. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he also saw a rock cut out without hands, and it does something that amazed him. It struck the feet of the statue, and the statue disintegrated, and the wind blew it away, and there was no trace of it left. And then that stone cut out without hands grew into a mountain, and it filled the entire earth. So that comprised Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then Daniel was brought in to explain it to him. And you can read about that in Daniel chapter 2. Now in Daniel chapter 7, we're going to find out, and this is a little bit later, Nebuchadnezzar's dream was probably around 600, turn of the century, 590, somewhere in there. Daniel's vision, which he saw, which was covering the same kingdoms of the earth in the same period of time, that was in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, which is roughly 753 BC. So it's about 40 or 50 years after Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Daniel had a dream and visions in his head while on his bed. He wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke. I saw in my vision 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. There were things happening that were disruptive. There was a storm on the sea. And the thinking is that those 4 winds of heaven were either the 4 horsemen of chapter 6, or possibly just a general symbol of the tribulation and the great tribulation. 4 great beasts came up from that stirred up sea, each different from the other. So where Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue made out of precious metal, Daniel sees beasts instead. And we're going to go through this quickly. The first was a lion and had eagle's wings. That was Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. That lasted till 538 roughly. And then the Persians move in, and that's the let's go back here, sorry. That's verse 5. Another beast like a bear. It was raised up on one side, 3 ribs in its mouth, devour much flesh. That was the Persian Empire. And again, they're beasts. Daniel sees these as they are. They consume. And after this, he saw a leopard with 4 wings of a bird and 4 heads. That's Alexander the Great, who conquered the earth in just about 10 years, a pretty amazing feat. But what captures Daniel's attention is the 4th beast. And if you read Daniel chapter 7, you'll see how much space he gives to that 4th beast, describing it and then asking about it. a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, huge iron teeth corresponding to the iron of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, breaking in pieces, trampling the residue with its feet. It's ruthless, it's unstoppable. It was different, had 10 horns. He was looking at the horns. One of them, a little one, came up, and 3 of those original 10 horns gave way before this little one. And this little horn had the eyes of a man, and it began speaking pompous words. The actual literal translation is great things. So we have a picture here of what's come to be understood as the Antichrist. But at this point, Daniel's vision is interrupted, and he gets a picture of a window into heaven. Thrones, just like John in chapter 4. The Ancient of Days was seated. Garment as white as snow, white as pure wool. Throne was a fiery flame. Its wheels of burning fire. Fiery stream issued forth from before him. And then the thousands and thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. We saw those numbers in chapter 5 of Revelation. So a lot of this came out in Daniel, was imported into the book of Revelation as a kind of an authenticating scripture to depict that this is what Daniel had already seen so many hundreds of years before. And so these pictures of fire here, judgment, the court was seated, the books were open. This is a judgment scene. The judge is seated, the books are open, and he's getting ready to judge the earth. So Daniel was looking at the beasts. He's interrupted. His vision takes him into heaven. And then he hears these pompous words, these great things coming from earth again. So he turns his attention back to earth. And what's he see there? I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. And as that horn was speaking these pompous words, that beast, representing the kingdom of the Antichrist, was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame, to the lake of fire. We'll see that in chapter 19 and 20. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, but they lasted for a little while longer. And then his vision goes back to heaven again, and what's he see there? One like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and was brought near before him. To him was given dominion and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. So Daniel's seen all these kingdoms, these 4 beasts, and the 4th one terrified him. And yet all these beasts are going to pass away, according to Nebuchadnezzar's vision in chapter 1, and Daniel's vision here in chapter 7. So these 2 things correspond to what we're reading about in the book of Revelation, the 10 toes, the feet of iron mixed with clay. The stone cut out without hands is Jesus. He's going to come back and he's going to end all those kingdoms. Now let's just kind of summarize. Jesus spoke about lightning in the Olivet Discourse. Daniel spoke about flames, and then he said coming with the clouds of heaven. Ezekiel in chapter 1 and verse 4, we haven't looked at it yet, but he had a vision of a whirlwind coming out of the north, a great cloud with a raging fire engulfing itself. It was appearance like burning coals of fire, torches going back and forth. The fire was bright. Out of the fire went lightning, and there were flashes of lightning. So a lot of these pictures are what we've seen, or what we will see in the judgment scenes in the book of Revelation. And they have been spoken of well in advance here in Daniel and Ezekiel, and indeed by Jesus himself in the Olivet Discourse. So very much a scene of judgment. And then in the sheep and the goats judgment in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus says, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels." So fire is one of the motifs here. And let's take a quick look at Psalm 18. Psalm 18 incorporates many of these pictures. It is what's called a theophany, an Old Testament theophany, an appearance of God. And listen to the words. The earth shook, the foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken. So there's a whole lot of shaking going on. There's earthquakes here. Smoke went up from his nostrils, a devouring fire from his mouth. Darkness was under his feet. That's one of the bowl judgments on the kingdom of the Antichrist. He made darkness his secret place. The canopy around him was dark waters, thick clouds of the skies, thick clouds passed with hailstone and coals of fire. The Lord thundered there at the top right. From heaven, the Most High uttered his voice. Hailstones and coals of fire. We'll see hail in some of the judgments. The seventh trumpet and the seventh bowl judgment. 100-pound hail. Can you imagine a hailstone weighing 75 to 100 pounds? Not much surviving that. And lightning's in abundance. So the pictures here, very much what we're going to see as we look through this judgment section, particularly in the seventh seal, the seventh trumpet, and the seventh bowl, all containing earthquakes, judgment, lightning, thunder, noises and voices, and hail. And so very much a collection of all of those things here in Psalm 18 verses 7 through 15. So the Old Testament has spoken of this. And I'll just mention these in passing. Isaiah chapter 34 and Isaiah chapter 24 also speak of this time and use some similar language. So there's a quick look at the Olivet Discourse and then Daniel's dream in chapter 7 of Daniel. And now I'd just like to comment quickly on the relationship of the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments. And the question is, are they sequential as depicted in this slide? We show the 7-year tribulation. Do we run through the 7 seals, and then 7 seals, the 7th seal opens up the 7 trumpets, and we run through those next in time, and then the 7th trumpet sounds, and then we have the 7 bowl judgments. So this is just a pictorial depiction of a sequence of the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments, one after the other, all in order time-wise. So the question is, are these judgments sequential? Or are they somewhat parallel? We just call this kind of the parallel situation, where they overlap some, and these trumpet judgments represent the seal judgments intensification, and then the bowl judgments are the trumpets intensified. And I've got a slide coming up shortly where we can look at that intensification process. So is it sequential? Like that? Is it parallel? Like that? Or is it some combination thereof that just kind of, let's just call it a combination? Eclectic, a bit of each, some sequence and some intensification. I tend to agree with Scott Duvall. This is out of his commentary. He says the major choice regarding interpretation is whether to see the book as chronological prediction or as repeating and overlapping. And there's the chronological or sequential picture. And he says the other choice is repeating and overlapping with a message about the past, present, and future. So kind of a eclectic mix, a stirred up mix, a little bit messy perhaps, but not strictly chronological. And there's the parallel situation, and yeah, it may or may not be that, but I tend to agree with him that the second option seems to match up better with the way things are described in the book of Revelation. Seems to make better sense of with the Olivet Discourse, the other prophecies, and the unfolding of the seven trumpets, seven seals, seven trumpets, and seven bowls. And so you just have to come to your own conclusion. To me, it seems like the seal judgment, and part of the complicating factor is the sixth seal seems like it's the end, the very end. Each of the seventh trumpet has elements of that particular final finish point as well, and certainly the seventh bowl. The angel says it is done, it is finished. So just keep an open mind and just ask the Lord for wisdom and insight as we read this, and as you read this and study it. And just be aware that things may not be perfectly sequential in terms of how this is all going to work out. And so possibly there's a bit of the sequential and there's a bit of the parallel going on here, kind of a mix. So this next slide will show kind of the correspondence between especially the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. And if we just kind of line them up, we've got the seal judgments at the top there, the white horse, red horse, black horse, etc. And then the number 7 seal on the right. And then in the middle, the trumpet judgments. The first trumpet affects the earth, the second, the sea, the third, the waters, the fourth, the sky. The fifth trumpet is called woe number 1. The locusts come out of the pit, the kingdom of darkness. Woe number 2 has to do with an army in the Euphrates River. And woe number 3, that's the 7th trumpet there in the middle on the right. That's kingdom transfer. Now if you look, the bowl judgments affect the exact same elements that the trumpet judgments, only instead of 1/3 as in the trumpet judgments, they're still partial in the trumpet judgments. The bowls are full of God's wrath. So here we have a corresponding, in terms of what's impacted, and also a corresponding intensification of that judgment that was rendered in the trumpet judgment now becomes the full bowl of God's wrath in the bowls, in the bowl judgments. So there's a fair amount of overlap here, and it seems as if, at least in the trumpets and the bowls, there's an intensification and a correspondence where they're operating in parallel, where the trumpet judgments are in place, and as they intensify, they become the bowl judgments where God calls a halt to just about everything. And so there's a little bit of both going on here. There's a bit of a sequential nature, and there's also the parallel intensification, as you can see from this slide. So keep an open mind. It does get a little confusing if you've got one thing in mind and then something different happens. So as you're reading and studying through this, just remember that there's probably more to it than any simple kind of pattern or interpretation. And that brings us to our final slide, which you've seen before. This is the what do you want to call it, the timeline, the outline of Revelation. And so on the far left there in red, chapter 1, write the things which you have seen. Chapter 2, the things which are. Chapters 2 and 3, that's the letters to the churches. Chapters 4 and 5, we looked at those, and that's praise for the Lamb in heaven, and just that universal song that was being sung to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And then the grouping chapters 6 through 19 is what we've just introduced here in this video, narrated PowerPoint. And so hopefully that'll kind of put it all in perspective for you. And as you begin reading in chapter 6 and continuing on through chapter 19, there's a lot going on. But remember, try to remember how it fits together here. 6 through 19 is the judgment section. Well, we're going to have the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments. We've got the interludes in there describing some other things that give us some background of what's going on and how things work out in particular. So just a lot going on. Take your time. If there's things that confuse you or you don't understand, write them down, ask questions, look at different commentaries, pray. And the Lord wants us to understand this, perhaps not all of it with clarity, but the gist of it, the major divisions and the major the things that he wants us to learn and to observe. So thank you for staying with me through this introduction to chapters 6 through 19. And the next narrated PowerPoint will be beginning with the seal judgments in chapter 6. So we'll see you then. Thank you.